Yes, hello, welcome. It is a history session and not English, as we have met in the English language sessions. But again, I welcome you in the history session. And we start our topic, that is the Form 3 topic, which is called the establishment of colonialism in Africa. So this topic is all about colonialism in Africa. How colonialism was established in Africa. What were processes that colonialists used to establish colonialism in Africa. So you are mostly welcome in our history session. So dear students, firstly, we have to check, or we have to know the meaning of colonialism. What the term colonialism is meant. So the term colonialism is the tendency or situation whereby powerful country dominates a weak country in all aspects of life, such as socially, politically, economically, and culturally. So this is colonialism. So it was a situation or tendency by which colonialists, and when we are talking about colonialists, we mean those European imperialist powers, European nations, such as Italy, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, and other European nations. So this was the situation whereby those nations came in Africa and dominated Africa, controlled Africa, ruled Africa in all spheres of life. So by that time, African states or countries were under the control of colonialists in all spheres of life. So all African life were under the colonial control. And this tendency or this incidence was established in Africa due to the development of capitalism in Europe and not Africa, as the writer has written here. So it was because of the development of capitalism in Europe. So this incidence led to the establishment of colonialism in Africa. So it was all about capitalism. That is to say, without capitalism, without development of capitalism, it could happen that colonialism will not exist in Africa. So we can't explain much about colonialism without tracing about capitalism. So let us now discuss the concept of capitalism, so that we will much have a lot of understanding, a lot of knowledge on the concept of colonialism. So dear students, capitalism, the term capitalism, this is the system. It is a system of life with the private ownership of the major means of production. It is a socio-economic and a political system of life. But this system is characterized with the private ownership of the major means of production. So in this system, the major means of production, the wealth are owned by few people, and those people are called capitalists, or other name we may call them, out of being landlord, we may use other terminologies like those bourgeoisies who owns the wealth as the result of the gap between lower classes and the higher classes. And since they are higher classes, then they make profit maximization. So in capitalism, there is much exploitation, so that those few classes who are capitalists may have profit maximization. So development of this system now, the development of capitalism in Europe led to the rise of that term that is colonialism in Africa. So African colonization was the result of development of capitalism in Europe. And here, dear student, in talking capitalism, it is amongst of those modes of production that we have discussed in Form 2 topic. That is modes of production in pre-colonial African societies. And those modes include communalism, that was the first mode, slavery, the second mode, as well as feudalism. So, out of having those few that I have mentioned in Africa, even in Europe, they had those modes of production, including those feudalism and capitalism. Though colonialists claim that for them, they started with feudalism, then they made transition from feudalism to capitalism. So in their development of that new system that is capitalism, led them into having the problem of capitalist demands or industrial demands, particularly in the second stage of capitalism, that was industrial revolution. So because of industrial revolution, made them to have faced with the problems of industrial demands. And those problems such as raw materials, market, areas for investment, cheap labor, and areas for settlement, forced them to find out solutions against their problems. How could them afford? How could them get those demands? So the only solution, they had to go far away from Europe. So the first stage, they had to send those agents of colonialism or agents of industrial capitalism. So and those agents, they moved into groups such as traders, missionaries, explorers, as well as traders and companies and associations. So in their movement, they had to find out to the world those problems that were faced by their mother countries, which were colonialist. How could they get raw materials? How could they get areas for investment, cheap labor, areas for settlement, as well as market? So they moved into groups and go into various parts of the world, including Africa, America, and Asia, so that they can get those demands. And in their findings, they then discovered, they made a lot of discoveries. Then they sent back important information about those findings that they have made. So from there now, colonialists got their results on their faced problems. So those results marked to the establishment of colonialism in Africa. So colonialism and capitalism cannot be separated because one was the result of another. That is, capitalism was the result of colonialism. So without capitalism, maybe we could not have colonized. Africa could not have colonized by colonialists or by Europeans. So that is a few introduction about the meaning of colonialism. So please let us match carefully, listen carefully, so that we can get what we deserve to get. So dear students, as I have said that colonialism was the result of development of capitalism in Europe. So that system led them to find out against their problems that were faced. And the system itself, that is capitalism, started in Europe as the result of the decline of feudalism. So capitalism, existence of capitalism, was the result of the decline of feudalism. So please, let us be attentive. We may now discuss few or in shortly about those modes of production in Europe. So as I said that Europeans claim that for them they started with feudalism. That is different from Africa. Since in Africa we have learned that Africans, we passed through 3 modes of production. Pre-colonial modes of production. We passed through about those 3, which were communalism, slavery, and feudalism. So all African societies passed through communalism. After communalism, others now were made transition from either communalism to slavery, while others they made transition from communalism to feudalism. Since slavery existed in some of African societies or states, such as Egypt, as well as most of coastal states in Africa, were the ones where slavery was common practiced. So that is the history of African modes of production. But once we are discussing now about Europe, they say that Europeans had passed through only 2 modes of production, which are feudalism and capitalism. So they do protest that they had passed through communal life as well as slave life. They only claim that those 2 were only practiced in Africa and not in Europe. So in their life, they started with feudalism. So the collapse of feudalism now marked into the beginning of capitalism. And this capitalism now, later on, led to the establishment of colonialism in Africa, or marked to the colonization of African continent. So that capitalism in its existence, it passed through 3 stages into maturity. It did not happen that at once then capitalism got matured, not. But it passed through different stages into maturity. And those stages include mercantilism or commercial capitalism that started from 1450 to 1750. Then after it happened into competitive capitalism or industrial capitalism that started from 1750 to 1850. And the last stage, but not least, was imperialism or monopoly capitalism that lasted from 1850s up to that time. So we are now in imperialism or monopoly capitalism. So any development of those stages, these stages, their existence and their development marked into establishment of colonialism in Africa, or they marked the colonization of African continent. So let us be careful so that we may now have a lot of understanding about the topic of colonialism. Let us now trace how colonialism was established in Africa. So let us proceed with the background on the establishment of colonialism in Africa. So as I said earlier, that colonialism in Africa was the result of industrial revolution that led into 5 demands of industrial capitalism. So European industrialization led to the emergence or existence of 5 demands of industrial capitalism. So those demands now first them into having the interest of establishing colonialism in Africa. So now let us discuss those 5 demands of industrial capitalism. How did they lead into colonization of Africa? So the first demand was the need of raw materials. the need of raw materials. And when we are talking about raw materials, here we are talking about those minerals, agricultural products like sisal, coffee, not only agricultural products, even ivory and others. These are examples of raw materials. So, industrialization in Europe that started from 18th to 19th century. Firstly, during the industrialization in Europe, there were availability of plenty raw materials, since industries were few in Europe. But upon the time once industrialization now spreaded in most of European countries, since the first country to industrialize was British or Britain. So after the British industrialization, then it is spreaded all over, all in most of European countries, such as France, Italy, Germany, Spain, and the other European nations. So after now, rapid industrialization led to the problem of raw materials. So raw materials became scarce and became most wanted in most of European industries. So because of that problem now, they had to find out solution. How can they solve that problem of industrial revolution? I mean the problem of raw materials caused by industrial revolution. So it was a time then they sent those agents of industrial capitalism so that they could find out the places where raw materials can be obtained. And in their findings of those explorers, missionaries, traders, companies, and associations, they get to know that African continent is the one of the best solution. Since by that time, most of African countries or states or those colonies had the fertile land, had the minerals, availability of minerals, which were mostly wanted as the raw material to feed in their industries. So because of that problem of raw materials, and after getting the solution that Africa could be the right solution, led to the having colonial interest of colonizing Africa as a result of colonization of Africa because of the problem of raw materials. Out of raw materials, another industrial problem or problem of industrial capitalist was areas for investment. So another demand was areas for market. It is areas for market before checking on areas for investment. So they were finding for the market so that they can sell their goods which were produced or manufactured in their industries. And this was after the rapid industrialization in Europe. So rapid industrialization in Europe led to the problem of market, since many industries were there with a few consumers, with a few markets, since everywhere industries were there. In England, those states, Wales. So every town, Manchester, Liverpool, every town that you go, industries are there with a few markets. So they had to find out the solutions. Where could they get market so that to sell their manufactured goods from the industry? And mind you that this was the time of industrialization or industrial revolution. So after those explorers, traders find that Africa had the accessibility of people. Many people were there with no modern goods, with no clothes, with no shoes, with no modernization. They had to modernize them. They had to civilize them so that they could sell their goods. So in finding now for the areas of market led to the colonization of Africa. So colonialists had to colonize Africa so that they could get areas for market. Again, there was a problem of cheap labor. This point we are discussing in two phases. Phase 1, cheap labor were needed for profit maximization. Profit maximization. This is the first phase, or first important need of cheap labor. Since any capitalist need to maximize profit so that he or she can move up and not down. Since the system itself needs a person to move up and not down. So once that bourgeoisie moves up and that lower class remain at the lower, results into gap. So this gap leads to exploitation, and this exploitation marks profit maximization. Since that capitalist could every day make profit, every day exploit that labor by giving him or her low price, by make him to work for a long time, working hours, and other ways of exploitation. And they practice these forms of exploitation so that to maintain profit maximization. So because of the profit maximization, and they believed that African laborers are cheaper, like those animals like donkeys or monkeys. Once you give him or her a salt, then he or she is satisfied. That is different from European labor. So because of that, they had to find those cheap laborers, and the only place where cheap laborers were found was Africa. So because of that need of cheap labor led to the colonization of African continent, or led to the establishment of colonialism in Africa. Another phase of that point, the need of cheap labor, was that industrial revolution in Europe led to the two major impacts, or group of impacts: negative impacts and positive impacts. Amongst of negative impacts was the rise of working class movement. So those European laborers were hit against the industrial revolution because of those negative impacts that happened, such as mass unemployment. They claimed that after most of European nations to get into industrialization led to the problem of unemployment to the most of European nations. For example, it was estimated that about 15 people, only 3 were employed. Since those works that were done by human beings were now replaced by machines. For example, we may find that a farm has employed 100 laborers. But after industrial revolution now, or after industrialization, there is emergence of a tractor. But this tractor needs only 60 people to operate it. So you may see that numbers of laborers have lost their employment because of the emergence of that machine, of that modern machine. So most of European laborers were against of industrial revolution because it led them into problem of unemployment. Again, industrial revolution in Europe led to long working hours. Since after the existence of machines or introduction of machines, the working hours were now increased since that electricity were now constantly found, so that people could work from 10 to 12 hours, others worked from 10 to 15 hours. So this led to the resistance or movement to the most of European workers or laborers. So this movement now, or those demonstrations, led Europeans to change their minds from using European labor into African laborers. And those movements were like Ladism in 1822, and this movement, this Ladism, was breaking machine movement. It started in Britain. So those Britain workers or laborers started to violate machines, since they believed that those machines were the source of their problems. Another movement was called Chartism and trade unionism. So now, because of those movements led to the change of European minds, and these changes was from using European labor and now need those African labor. So it's where now Europeans had the interest of having African cheap labor. So this interest led them into having the intention of having colonialism in Africa, or establishing of colonialism in Africa. So colonialism was established because of the need of cheap labor as another factor. Again, there is areas for investment. Areas for investment, it was in a sense that because of industrialization in Europe, they were in need of those farms, big farms, which they could get those raw materials. So those farms were needed places or areas to invest in them. So in need of those areas for investment, resulted to the establishment of colonialism in Africa, since they had to get those areas where they could invest their farms, their capitals, their shops, where those European manufactured goods could be sold there. And another was the areas for settlement. And this demand was because those coordinators, operators of their different projects in Africa, they were in need of areas to settle. They had to build their houses, their schools, and the different infrastructures. So areas for settlement were necessary to those colonialists or capitalists. So because of these numbers of factors led to the colonization of Africa. And here there is a question that was asked in 2016. And the question is, explain how industrialization led to colonization of African continent. 5 points. And this could be our task of our lesson. So we have to discuss on how industrialization, European industrialization, led to the colonization of African continent. Only 5 points. So we may try to have this exercise so that we will be able in the part of introduction of colonialism in Africa. Thank you.